need to. Thank you very much. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording of that will end up on YouTube, and there'll be a link to that appearing on the Wangaratta Landcare and Sustainability's website in the next few days once that's in place. So if you want to revisit it, you're able to do that. Now, I've got to say I'm going to continue. Yes, thank you. Introducing our speakers for tonight. First of all, we'll be hearing from Bronwyn Chapman, who's the Executive Officer of the Goulburn Murray Greenhouse Alliance. We'll be hearing then from Simon Francis, who's the Environmentally Sustainable Development Officer from the City of Greater Bendigo. Then from Dion Stevenson, who is a local developer with a civil engineering background. And finally from Lockie Gales from Ovens and King Builders. Lockie's a director of that enterprise. They'll be speaking for a total of about 45 minutes, and we're anticipating having about 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you'd like to enter those into the chat as we're going along, that'd be terrific. Or simply stick up your hand when we get to the question and answer session at the end. No further ado, I'd like to introduce Bronwyn Chapman. Bronwyn is, as I said, the Executive Officer of the Goulburn Murray Greenhouse Climate Alliance, it is now. Yes, and this was the Murray Goulburn Broken Greenhouse Alliance, but I understand a few extra councils have joined recently, Bronwyn, so there's been a name change to capture that broader spread of members. So over to you.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone, and really good to see so many people come to join us tonight. Night like tonight, Zoom does have some advantages. I'll just share my screen. Hold on 1 second, there we go. So I'm the Exec Officer at this organisation, Goulburn Murray Climate Alliance, and we're actually 16 organisations that work together on climate change and have done in various ways since 2009, and that includes 13 councils. And you can see on the screen the span we have, so it's a quite large area, and we've done a lot of collaborative projects. And the other thing is that there's a variety of these climate or greenhouse alliances around the state. By next year, nearly every council in Victoria will be joined to one of these alliances, and that's a distinctly Victorian thing, which is helping us to work on some even bigger projects around climate and greenhouse action. But tonight I've been asked to speak to you about what does the climate look like in our area and what's it going to look like in our area. And one of our partners is the North East Catchment Management Authority, who's done some important work in this in the last couple of years. So they had a look at both temperature and rainfall in the Northeast region. So if you have a look at this, these maps that I've brought up, we're over here. So that's the rural city of Wangaratta there. And then this is the whole region going across to the alpine areas over here. And at this particular one, hold on, I've just got to move my screen. We're looking at January maximum temperatures. So a lot of projects have a look at average temperatures, but the data has become a lot more sophisticated in the last 5 to 10 years. So now, in fact, this project decided no, average temperature didn't actually tell us a lot about what we were going to expect. So we looked at a range of factors, 10 different temperature factors and another 10 rainfall factors. So you can see from this, looking at that January maximum temperature, the redder it is, the hotter on the scale. And you can see that we're seeing from our historic period of 1986 to 2005, as we move across to 2030 and 2050, that those hotter temperatures are going to extend further across the catchment and affect a great many more areas than have done before. So this, and we're in the plain, a good part of the Wangaratta Council is in the plains area, and it's particularly affected by this heat. And the next one is looking at January days over 35. And again, you can see this is quite distinct to what's happening in January with these hotter periods in 2030 and 2050. You can see those redder areas in that northwest sector, and pretty much all of the catchment affected to a certain extent. The other thing I'll say is that you can see that there's a whole lot of little squares in these maps. So this is for the whole catchment, but you can actually go onto the Northeast CMA website and pull out this project, which is called Embedding Climate Change in Agriculture. And there's some instructions there. You can actually drill into the area where you live and have a look at what's happening in that particular area. So it's a really important tool. And we can see in our record that this is happening as well. So that top graph is Wodonga, days over 38 degrees from about 1970 on, and you can see that clear pattern of warming from about the mid-90s onwards. And that's the pattern that we're seeing projected in these future patterns. And even though we've had a mild summer for various reasons, this year, the previous two summers, we might recall, were not mild at all. And in fact, 2019, as you can see on that map, that brown colour, the dark brown colour, was highest on record in terms of heat. So 2019 was the summer where we had a number of highest ever temperatures broken. And in Wodonga, they broke their record twice in about a week. In January, I think Wangaratta got very close to its record. And we have to start thinking about what's going to be happening with our summer in the future and how that's going to affect. Tonight we'll hear about building operations and planning for subdivisions. So you can drill into this data, and this is actually some data I pulled out. This is for the pattern across the whole catchment that we can see. And this is actually a graph of temperatures across the year. So this work doesn't tell you what's happening in a particular area as an average. You can actually pull out the pattern and have a look at it as well. And so the grey is that historic period, 86 to 2005. The blue is around year 2030, and they don't just take 2030, they take a range around that period and examine that. And then the red is the 2050, and you can see with temperature, you can see that pattern climbing. But what's interesting here as well is what's happening to the length of summer as we think about it. So you're looking down the bottom at the months across the year. And if you have a look, say, at the right, we've got the start of summer. If you can see my cursor, December. And that temperature that was historic in December is now going to, or will occur in the future, and we're seeing this pattern already as well, will occur in the future earlier in the year. So that same temperature over here is going to occur a month earlier. And at the other end of the season, in February, that temperature that we think of in February historically is going to occur about half a month later in the year. So summer's not only getting hotter, it's getting longer. And we're seeing that reflected in what we saw in that last really bad fire season, and we have been seeing it for some years with the fire season, where the fire season starts earlier in the year. It's basically moving forward in the year, and that's just reflecting these hotter conditions that we're having. So when we have a look at rainfall, temperature in terms of science, knowledge and projections is much, I guess, better known its future patterns than rainfall, which are a lot more variable. So when you have a look at rainfall, the darker the blue, the higher the rainfall. The yellow areas are that lower rainfall. And again, you can see some change in the area, but it's not as stark as that temperature change. But when you combine temperature and rainfall, that has an effect on how much water will run off from the catchment, because you're going to have higher evaporation. Just if you pull out the figures for this, we're looking at about 2030 is not too bad compared to that historic, which gives us, I guess, a decade to make some preparations. But 2050, we're seeing about a 10% decline in rainfall on average by then. Not every year will be the same. The sort of thing you'll see is that you'll just see these hotter, dry years occurring more often in the years. And so maybe we would have had one of these really hot years every 6-7 years. And then in those 1980s sort of period, and now we probably might be seeing them one every 5. I'm just giving you a pattern here. And then by 2030, it might be 2 or 3. And by 2050, it might be the norm. So that means when you have a look at these patterns, someone born before 2020 will not know that previous climate that we thought of when we were growing up. So it's quite a stark change. Now, these maps have a look at what's going to happen to that runoff. As I said, there's a combination of the rainfall change and the higher temperatures. The browner areas are decreasing runoff. And again, you can see this pattern across the catchment. You've got the historic over here on the left, 2030 on the upper right, and the 2050 on the lower right. And so you can see in our area, there's a drying pattern happening, surface runoff, and over in the east as well as a number of areas down the south. So overall, and again, this is still, I guess, in the has a degree of error in the projection, but the modelling is of the order of around 20% reduction in runoff and stream flow by about 2030 and up to 30% by 2050. So that's quite significant. So overall, what it means is we're going to have longer, on average, not every year, but more years than we've ever known before will be longer, hotter summers and drier years. So this just gives that sort of summary, and trying to bring it down from some of the national figures that we might have. So for Australia, we know that in the last century, the mean has become around 1.4 degrees hotter. But when the mean becomes hotter, those extremes become more marked. They expand further than we think from the mean. So we're looking at twice as many days over 35. As I said, summer is going to be at least a month longer in the future. By 2030, we're going to have these drier conditions. The fire seasons will be longer. And the other issue is we're looking at potential heat impacts because we're going to have an older and larger population as well. So they're the sorts of things we have to think of. And for the last few decades, every decade has been hotter than the last. So it's quite a lot to adapt to. So what does it mean for the development we're talking about tonight and how we might design development and houses for these conditions? So these are some thermal images that were taken by another alliance over in central Victoria, Wangaratta. And you can have a look at these. They're days where it was a summer day, and the heat pattern over here where there's very little shade, and potentially if you're looking at heat, looks like the coolest thing in the houses is the windows, where maybe all their cool air is coming out the windows. And you're looking at temperatures around the 40s, in the street, the rooftop of the house and the like. And over here we have an area with a good bit of shading, and that shading is having a very marked effect. I'll just move my items here. So out on the asphalt, as it said, it's about 42 degrees, but beneath the trees and where there's some irrigation, it's around 20 degrees. So these sorts of thinking about what we're going to be facing for heat is really going to help us think about how we're going to design our areas and also our buildings. And that just gives you a quick overview of some of the information we've got available to us to help us think about these things.
Rightio, Bronwyn, thank you very much for that. That gives us a really good introduction to what's in front of us, some of the things we're going to have to within some hints there too, I think, on how on some of the things we can do to keep ourselves a bit more comfortable. Thank you very much. Our next speaker tonight is Simon Francis, who's the Environmentally Sustainable Development Officer from the City of Greater Bendigo. Simon's has worked as a town planner and environmentally sustainable design officer for the City of Greater Bendigo for the last 12 years. His council is a member of the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment, which is auspiced under the Municipal Association of Victoria, and is run by local councils to improve the environmental sustainability development outcomes in that area. Simon's a strong advocate for regional councils and communities receiving the same level of sustainably designed buildings as metropolitan councils are. And some other things, he's been instrumental in getting a sustainable subdivisions framework to be trialled by 31 councils in a step towards delivering that outcome. And there's also an investigation of the feasibility of councils in the Loddon and Campaspe Regional Partnership sharing an ESD officer. Simon's been able to realise an ambition of getting the Bendigo Council to be one of the first, or the first regional council, I understand, with ESD planning policy embedded into their planning scheme. And then I think that came to fruition in 2018 with amendments requiring that developments of 3 or more dwellings or commercial developments of greater than 500 square metres having to deliver sustainable design solutions as part of their applications for planning permits. So Simon, welcome, and thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, John. Just bear with us. If you wanted to jump to someone else, I could just have a play with the settings. My apologies to everyone.
No, that's okay. John, who was next on our list?
Yes, okay. Simon, good luck with sorting that one out. It's a presenter's nightmare, I reckon. Next on our speaking list tonight is Dion Stevenson. Dion's a small-scale local developer with a civil engineering background, and he's aspiring to seeing better environmental and social outcomes in residential developments. So Dion, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I was a bit worried because I didn't have a presentation, but I might have dodged a bullet, I think. I'm relatively new to developing. My background is as a contractor in civil engineering businesses. So I have been an infrastructure provider as a contractor, but my real world experience in developing is only over the last few years. As we go along, I'll probably refer to our experience or our development, and that's because my wife and I consider a partnership in our developing. Our first experience developing was Kaluna Estate in Wangaratta, which has been completed now for about 18 months, possibly a little bit longer. And it was a 17-lot development, so a relatively small development in a location that we thought was a terrific location and very close to town relative to other developments. Currently, there's 9 houses being completed. There's 4 in progress, and there's 4 blocks that are still vacant. So what did we do different? We ensured that on the site there was no native vegetation that was cleared, and there was a stand of native veg that was incorporated into the drainage basin, so it wasn't able to be altered by anyone else, so that's become public land. We did have an issue with council not wanting to support putting a divided road with an island around it, around a magnificent old red gum, and luckily the residents came to our rescue there. So we had a good outcome in relation to the native veg there. We were required to provide offset, but the tree is still standing, so it's within an island in the road reserve. We included standing water in the drainage retention basin, which is relatively uncommon, but is done in other locations, but that enabled us to incorporate a functional wetland. And we had some unique covenants. So they included a minimum 3 kilowatt solar system to be incorporated into any building, a $500 contribution to landscaping for native vegetation to each of the residents or each of the lots, membership to the Wangaratta Urban Landcare Group in the hope that people would become better connected with Landcare, and no cats, which was a pretty controversial one, primarily because of Kaluna Park, which is, and Kaluna Island, which are relatively nearby. The development was right on the banks of the King River, effectively. In addition, outlined in a letter to the residents, we shared our vision for a lower impact development with the residents, paying particular attention to the need for flowering native plantings, and in particular to support the local bird life, which is pretty extraordinary in that location, and particularly because it's so close to the middle of town. The question I've been asked most is what did all that cost? Which is a difficult question to answer because there was some tangible costs associated with things like fencing the wetland, which we were unable to convince the council that needed to be public open space. And, you know, preserving the stand of native veg meant that each of the 17 lots was reduced by a little bit of land area, which potentially cost us money. However, overall, our expectations in relation to the sale of the blocks or the land value increased, and we believe by taking the approach we did that it contributed to it. So from our perspective, or the developer's perspective, is to provide some positive outcomes environmentally and for climate. It effectively came at a nil cost or cost neutral outcome. So for me, the next question is, well, what was successful? And look, obviously the stuff that was part of the subdivision itself, so part of the infrastructure or part of the layout, so preserving the native veg and the wetland were clearly an outcome that was achieved. We have, I've actually been there today and counted how many solar systems are on top of the roofs, and out of the 9 houses that are completed, there's 6 with solar systems. So I can say that's 66% or 2/3 successful. However, I'd be hopeful over the next 8 builds that will increase. And the response to the landscaping contribution has been less than 10%, so which I find pretty remarkable, given that it was a free kick for everybody to go to Park Lane Nursery and buy $500 worth of native plants. So what did we learn? I think the biggest lesson for me was that the housing market consumer is primarily driven by cost. So my observation or what's actually happened is there's a high uptake of volume builders. And hand in hand with that, there appears to be no regard for aspect or other passive elements in relation to the build. So, you know, for example, we've seen garages, you know, every second garage or more is on the north side of the building, where, you know, clearly you would be looking for some solar gain if you'd gone to a designer or an architect and built a custom home. It's fair to say we hoped for some better outcomes, but I think what we achieved and what we were able to demonstrate for Wangaratta with that development was, you know, that something can be done. It doesn't cost the developer, and it was a step in the right direction. Just a note on our subsequent project. So we've completed another project, which was a small residential subdivision, and we're currently embarking on another small residential subdivision and build. So we've built townhouses and we're embarking on another one as we speak. And it was actually a conscious decision on our behalf after seeing the lack of regard or detail in relation to the next steps of the building phase of the land subdivision that we did, that we've decided that we would not only subdivide land but build as well. That way we've got control. So what are the opportunities? I see one of the biggest opportunities is in doing something about energy production in the country. And I've concentrated on the causes of climate change more so than how to design and deliver homes for the future. But I think that still the largest contributor within Australia to greenhouse gas emissions is the energy production, both for residential and industrial, as well as industrial heating and things like that. So if I were to say what the big ticket item is, I'd say no new home should be built without solar, and even better, solar and battery systems as well, battery storage. I think another opportunity is in better use of passive elements. So aspect is really important in building, and ventilation and things like that. Obviously driving down the energy costs and energy demands of a home. I've also got a personal view that size of homes could be reduced to give better outcomes as well. And also better use of land through reducing lot sizes as well. Everybody wants a bigger, better one. But another one of the reasons we're doing townhouse work is because we can get better land use. Materials choice, that sort of thing, obviously a big player, and a whole raft of other building elements that come into play, and hopefully Lockie will touch on some of those. And as I said, I haven't really tackled building for more extreme climate or how to actually build a house that will better cope with 2050. So how do we make all that happen? And at the risk of sounding preachy, not peachy, and like I'm passing the buck, I think the lion's share of the change needs to be in the hands of the regulator, and I'm absolutely stoked to hear the things that Simon's doing in Bendigo. That's fantastic. Reflecting on our own experience, I kind of take the view that, you know, the primary driver for a lot of people in either building their first home or upgrading is to get a better location, a bigger house, a newer house, and a lot of that's driven by best bang for your buck. So to achieve their goals, volume builders or builders that are doing a lot more work and are delivering cheaper homes are an obvious solution. So that needs to be acknowledged, and I think that's where the regulator will play a big part, because if changes are prescribed, then in a very competitive environment, those or all of the volume builders have to change the way they operate. And I've plucked a couple of examples. One is if it's a requirement that no new house can be built without a solar array, and that should be sized according to square meters of the house or numbers of bedrooms or whatever the driver is or whatever the requirements are. Then obviously people buying a home, they go to the bank, they work out what they can afford, they go to the builders, they get the price, and if the alfresco area goes at the cost of the solar array, then the solar array has to go onto the building rather than trying to get a bigger house with an alfresco. Just as an example. Another example is aspect. Certain percentage of living space must be north facing. The overhangs need to be designed properly to ensure that it's not a heat burden in summer and the maximum, and able to maximise the solar gain in winter. They're pretty fundamental concepts that are well understood, but there's nothing to drive the volume builders and the bulk of the market in that direction. And it needs to be on the basis of a level playing field. So don't get me wrong, I think there's room for builders, developers on a project by project basis to do the best they can, and to work with councils and come up with better solutions. But a really good example for me, harking back to the 66% take up of the solar requirement in our land sales, is that those covenants are there to protect the residents, or they're there to the rights of the residents are what are being preserved. We're no longer landholders, so I can do nothing as the developer to ensure that requirement to put a minimum 3 kVA system on your roof is able to be achieved or is enforced. So there's intent, but it's difficult to follow up with. So there's a lot can be done through the or via the regulator, and I also think on an individual basis there's a lot to be done through education, letting the greater community know what a good build looks like. So that's me, and thank goodness I didn't have a presentation to share, and you've had to look at my mug for the whole time. Thank you very much.
Dion, thanks very much for that, and thanks for sharing that story about the work you've done. That's fascinating stuff. I've got one, and interesting to hear the learnings and what you're planning to do in the future as a result of last time round. I've had one question come through that I think will be very simple to answer, so I'll chuck it in now. Can you tell us what the streets are, the names of the streets in the Kaluna estate?
The new street is Sanctuary Court. The main, or the arterial in, is, I think it's now called, it used to be called Chandler Street, and what's it called now?
Is it Weir Street?
Weir Street.
Beautiful.
So we had to make Weir Street a sealed road as well, and put curb and channel and whatnot there. So
Good on you, Dion. Thank you very much for that one. Now, Simon, are you right to go now, mate? Simon, you're muted at the moment, so if you responded, I couldn't hear you.
Rightio. Let's see how this goes. Is that sharing okay now?
Looking good. We're looking at the
I'm sure my 11-year-old daughter is going to give me heaps in the morning when she sees me. And apologies to everyone for that. That was quite embarrassing. And thanks for John for the introduction earlier. Good evening, everyone, and my apologies to you too, Dion, for putting you on the spot. But I think I broke the ice pretty poorly with my setup. Now, I've been asked to discuss ESD from a local government perspective and about the levers available to introduce ESD and what changes are expected in the coming years from government and regulatory bodies. And I have 10 minutes, of which I'm pretty sure I've used up 6 of them with my fumbling around. So we'll get into it. So ESD, what is ESD? ESD requires the effective integration of economic and environmental, social and equity considerations in decision-making processes. ESD aims to provide for the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. For a subdivision or a construction of a home, the principles aim to improve the health and comfort of occupants, whilst at the same time reducing negative impacts on the environment. So what does best practice ESD mean for a building? What you're reading does not mean that ESD does not have to be innovative. If council is going to ask players like Dion, Lockie and other small, medium and large scale developers when they lodge a planning permit application to implement ESD principles, they need to be cost effective and implementable with demonstrated benefits and preferably able to be sourced locally. There are a few levers local governments can use to increase ESD requirements from developments. One is the Planning and Environment Act and the subordinate legislation known as the planning scheme, which I'm sure both Dion and Lockie have had some positive and also negative experiences from. But the planning scheme itself is a very blunt tool. It's slow to react to desired changes of council and its community, but it does set the minimum standards that will be expected from an applicant who wants to lodge an application that triggers the need for ESD considerations. Sorry for the planning speak, but as a retired town planner, the planning scheme still cuts pretty deep for me. Although I wish this part wasn't true, local governments in the absence of government leadership at higher levels have had to take control and implement local planning policies into their planning schemes. That is really resource intensive for local governments, both financially and human resources, and it's not the best option moving forward. 20 odd councils have ESD local planning policies in their planning scheme, of which Bendigo is lucky enough to be one of those. And currently there's several other councils waiting on the Minister for Planning to approve their exhibited planning schemes amendments. The overarching objective is that a development should achieve best practice in environmental sustainable development from the design stage through to construction and then into operation, which goes to the point that what was just being mentioned, that some people don't always take up the opportunities provided to them, either that be via landscaping or be that by how they operate their dwellings. Local government need to be leaders first, in a combination with the planning system, and to ensure that a council is delivering on what they expect the community to deliver. Each council should have their own sustainable buildings policy, which goes beyond what is being asked of the community. Preferably zero carbon developments presented by councils, but we'll get to zero carbon in a minute. What's happening at a state government level? Due to the number of local governments with an ESD local policy continuing to increase, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning has moved to introduce statewide ESD measures into all planning schemes across Victoria. I'm certainly not here to bash the state government departments because they're doing some really, really great work. And this project that they're delivering now has stalled a little bit, but I'm hopeful it will kick back into gear and deliver ESD requirements to all the planning schemes in the near future. This will recognise ESD across all local governments, not just those who have extra resources, both human and financial. And generally speaking, those councils that do have an ESD resource are generally more well off in comparison to smaller rural and regional councils financially. But it will become the measurable requirements for developers to meet moving forward. My view is this will most likely focus on 3 or more dwellings on a lot and commercial and industrial developments with buildings with a gross floor area of greater than 500 metres square, which is the same triggers that we have in our planning scheme here in Bendigo for a developer. If they lodge an application with 3 or more dwellings or 500 square metres, they have to deliver on environment sustainable design requirements. The Council Alliance for Sustainable Built Environment is a collective of 32 member councils, auspiced under the MAV banner, continually striving to push for ESD in the built form that is climate resilient and either zero carbon emissions, but preferably carbon positive developments, meaning that the development produces more energy than they can use and transfer it back into the grid. But preferably, this is what we'd all prefer, in the future, that maybe it could be traded with your neighbour or within your locality or your local community. And that becomes an income stream that you're actually generating more than you produce, but you're closing down that network of distributed by poles and wire, but actually just distributed by member to member or neighbour to neighbour or community business to community business, so that the money stays within your community. We've already jumped past where the state government is heading with their ESD roadmap via CASB. And what we're trying to do is we lobby for change and use our collective voice to elevate a wide range of ESD measures, in particular energy efficiency measures at the state and federal level. And we also support each other in our transition and journey to implementing ESD within our local councils, but also within our local community. Like I said, we've jumped past where the state government's heading with their ESD roadmap and now putting pressure on them to be more responsive to the current urgency that it's required and aim higher than the roadmap, and they've recently done. This is occurring via our Elevating ESD Targets project, mentioned on this page that you're looking at now. The hyperlink will be there if anyone wants to go in and have a closer look, where 29 councils have signed a memorandum of understanding and contributed a small amount of money to take the research to the final feasibility and have expert evidence produced in support of zero carbon and resilient built form requirements in the planning system. For many rural and regional councils, the creation of a subdivision results in the creation of a new community. What started off with 6 councils in 2017 grew to 16 councils in 2019, and now has hit 31 rural and regional councils, along with growth area councils, trialling the sustainable subdivision framework over 18 months. That's 31 of 79 Victorian councils, which is the highest uptake of any voluntary scheme anywhere that I'm aware of. And it's an extraordinary number of councils trialling this. The aim really for us is to collect data on what subdivisions of greater than 3 lots are implementing across the participating councils and work with willing developers to implement ESD measures into their projects. Admittedly, there's been limited uptake by developers at this stage, and I totally understand that. It's quite a large document to enter data into, but the data is what's important at this early stage, and understanding what we're doing well and where we can improve and how the planning system assists in setting the measurable standards in the future is really important. Sorry for ranting on about the planning scheme, but it's for those of you who are still awake, it's a bit of a passion of mine, and one where I feel the greatest opportunity for local governments to implement and actually make meaningful change. So the creation of a subdivision is the creation of a community. Subdivision design commences with a relatively blank canvas, setting up the life of a community that will extend over hundreds of years. The initial subdivision design presents an enormous opportunity to create the fundamental conditions for a sustainable and resilient community. The long-term nature of subdivision planning is now set against the backdrop of our climate fundamentally changing. You know, as Bronwyn discussed, by 2070, for example, you know, temperature increases of between 1.5 and 3 degrees are expected. Is therefore critical to take a long-term view and consider the impacts of climate change over the entire life of the subdivision. Not just looking at the historic data to determine how you should design a subdivision. Once a subdivision is completed and the lots are available to buy, local planning departments don't have any say in the type of dwelling constructed, the energy efficiency of the dwelling, the ESD requirements of that dwelling, and rightly so. It's then left up to the homeowner to decide. They will generally speaking again, they will leave it in the hands of the drafting companies, architects, local builders, developers, volume builders, etc. And then they will engage others to determine the ESD requirements and how to construct the dwelling. So it really is up to the owner of the home to drive what they want, even though they might be influenced in other areas to as Dion mentioned earlier, to go for a different option. It's really important that they know what they want when they're building. It's also important to elevate the value of remnant vegetation, as Dion was discussing, you know, including large trees used for habitat and biodiversity conservation, along with the topography of the land, to be the first considerations that inform a subdivision design outcome. Too often I see a hill that is made flat for ease of development, and in turn changing the soil biota, which changes the biodiversity fundamentally. Okay, the image you are looking at here is a little bit out there for what we see here in Australia, but should it be? Going back to Dion's points, you can see that there's solar panels down the bottom. This would be set up to almost work like a microgrid, where that larger solar panels would be generating the energy for all the dwellings that are on that site. You can see, you know, large open space for down the central corridor, which, you know, there's cycling enabled, there's plenty of trees, not all canopy trees, some more ornamental clearly, but there's the opportunity for those to become canopy trees. You know, there's a great opportunity here to share electricity with your neighbour. This is sort of, not this particular image, but this is sort of what we're looking at. Dion was talking before about solar panels on your roof. That is one way to do it. There's other ways where you can do it in a more broader scale. And some subdivisions are looking to do that as we speak. What is proposed at the National Construction Code for the 2022 amendments? The Australian Building Codes Board, which is the ABCB, has been directed by the Building Ministers Forum to investigate possible changes to the National Construction Code for 2022 to bring in energy efficiency provisions with the emphasis on residential buildings. This work is to be carried out in consideration of the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, Energy Council's trajectory to low energy buildings. The trajectory proposes incremental changes to the National Construction Code to reduce the operational energy and use of associated greenhouse gas emissions of buildings. And it's about time. What we don't want to see, and I'm talking CASB here and people who you know, want buildings to be as efficient as they possibly can, what we don't want to see in the changes is a house being allowed to achieve a lesser star rating and be offset by a renewable energy system. Why not? Well, if a dwelling is constructed at 5 stars equivalent and is reliant on an oversized renewable energy system or a system to bring it up to 7 stars, if that system fails or never replaced by the owner when it reaches end of life, that building becomes an underperforming building and not would require climate resilient and have a high ongoing operational energy requirement. Combining improvements in thermal fabric of the building, insulation, high performance windows, airtight building fabric, and energy efficiency of the heating and cooling systems, and the appliances used in the building combined with on-site renewable energy is the way to go right now. And there's a sweet spot for investing in those. This is basically telling you that the National Construction Code is moving to 7 stars in 2022. And if you're not building to 7 stars now, then you're starting to design to that, then your buildings will be obsolete very soon. So what does the future look like? It's inspiring to hear Dion talking about what he's wanting to do and is doing and will continue to do. And there are others doing similar things now. Well, the future is here already and exists in developments like the Cape and Cape Patterson just south of Wonthaggi, where dwellings are a minimum 7.5 standards, have a minimum 2.5 kilowatt renewable energy attached, in a community that's based around water quality being a high priority, electric vehicle charging stations, trees and vegetation to reduce the urban heat island effect and provide cool paths for people to use alternative transport modes. The subdivision is not connected to gas, hence the housing is not connected to gas and are all electric. Here's another example. This is a case study of salt in Torquay. And the same as the two examples I'm showing, there is another one being just about undeveloped. It's a Villawood development. Their developments of land in Sunbury, where they're not connecting the subdivision to gas. Instead, are offering to provide solar and battery storage as part of the land package. This is actually cheaper for Villawood to provide, and the uptake from residents buying the lot has been overwhelming, and they said it hasn't affected their sales at all. It's about integrating water quality measures on site when land is not too flat to allow the water to be soaked back into the land and be treated on site before going back into the waterways, not shipped away via a pipe straight into creeks and waterways with high nutrient loads and suspended solids. My takeaway message is that the state government is moving on ESD. The National Construction Code is moving to 7 stars in 2022. So no one should settle for less, otherwise your dwelling will be obsolete before complete. It's all about all of these things and many, many more things, but 10 minutes is not long, especially when you're focusing on legislative stuff. Greater planting of street trees with canopy coverage and also around your home, depending on bushfire issues. Water efficient fixtures and fittings, rainwater tanks, landscaping that includes local plant species. Ensuring there is great crossflow ventilation, access to quality natural light and fixed shading to north windows, and operable shading devices to east and west facing windows. The roof forms need to be on the right angle to collect renewable energy and have your home ready for battery storage. A light colour roof, moving away from trendy dark roofs is, I don't know why people go for black roofs. It makes no sense to me. I understand that the building code encourages it depending on what climate zone you're in, but it just makes no sense. Please just don't do it. And it's also about building subdivisions that encourage and ensure that those opportunities can occur on site. It's about allowing planning for electric cars and your switchboard and your power supply. It's all of those things. What I would like to finish with is to emphasise that more importantly than having a great set of plans, whether it be dwelling plans or subdivision plans, is to engage a builder who has the support of contractors to deliver an energy efficient, safe and comfortable home to live in. Too often I hear about and see a great set of plans be handed over to someone who doesn't understand what it takes to make a building airtight, how to use permeable membranes and installs them incorrectly, and then, and how to ensure mold doesn't grow, has not installed insulation correctly and created a break for air to leak out, has insulated the corners of the building, and generally just hasn't taken the plans to the level that they were designed to. Sorry I went over, and thank you everyone.
Simon, thanks very much for that. A great sort of picture of the environment that we're working in, a few tips at the end there about how to get what we need from the people providing us with services if we are going into the building. Thank you again for that. And finally, our last speaker tonight, Lockie Gale from Ovens and King Builders here in Wangaratta. So Lockie, if you're ready to go, I'll hand over to you, please.
Thanks very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to listen to the other speakers. I've really got a lot of value out of listening to all of them. Clearly a lot of passion there and a lot of knowledge, and my hat's off to all of them. They're doing great work. From my point of view, I guess I will work at the pointy end of actually coming up with the goods with in the constructions that we have. I'm very fortunate to work on some really special houses. I know that in the audience tonight, there's a few people that know that personally, which is really, really good. I'm sure some of the stuff I got tonight is very much preaching to the converted, but I've got, in the time I've got, I can only talk to probably 2 or 3 things. Some of it's been touched on already, but I just want to underline that. I also want to take the moment to underline particularly what Dion and Simon have said about the regulatory frameworks, because the regulatory frameworks are the key to change. Change has to be brought on by regulation. I've been around in construction long enough to remember when we brought in minimum insulation requirements. It's hard to believe in my lifetime we could build a house without insulation. That single change back in the 80s, I think it was, made a significant difference. So moving to things like 7-star, it definitely, it's not, we won't get change without the regulation. So I support that absolutely. I want to share my screen. I've got just a few photos to talk to, which I hope will illustrate some of the points. Some of these photos might be familiar to some people. I hope they've been done discreetly. So I want to talk on 3 things. I want to talk about orientation very briefly, because that's, Simon and Dion have both pointed out the importance of that. I've got some practical examples here. I want to talk about technology for better performance, and I want to talk about the thoughtful execution of these things we do is to get the result. So here's a screenshot of a plan that we're currently working on. It's an existing house. It's an older style house. It's a Federation house, double brick, thermally. We all know those older red brick houses facing the street. Window orientation things just weren't a factor in 1920 when they were 1910 when they were built. So, but here's an example of a renovation extension where the thought's gone in to create a new living space, which is going to take advantage of that solar passive design principles, get some northern orientation in the main living area, and help transform that house into a much more efficient, much more livable space. It's still done in a very compatible style to the existing home. It's still red brick, but the cavity red brick is insulated. The windows are double glazed. The orientation of the windows is partly for the view, but also very much for that northern aspect. So that's an example of how when we come to an existing house, orientation, it's basic, it's free, it doesn't cost you anything, but it sets you up for success going forward. Here's another one of when we're talking about developments and estates. This is a job we did some years ago in an estate in Wangaratta. And you can see you drive down this very pretty estate, larger blocks, larger houses. And you can see the top left-hand image of the one house, which is the house we built, which has got a northern aspect, designed for solar passive. All the other houses, quality built, I guess, by reasonable builders and no doubt lovely people living in them. But there's no thought around anything around orientation. And yet the house we built, which rated pretty well, is certainly very livable and very comfortable. It didn't take much on a block that size to achieve great orientation. And it's too often where we see estates where this mindset of you've got to face the road just rules. So, but it can be done. It absolutely can be done. So orientation, it's basic, it's free, it sets you up, and it's proven. So when you sit down to design, that's the first thing. Some of the technologies we're working with now are just awesome compared to building products that have been around in years gone by. I've got a couple of examples here of cutaways of a couple of different windows. The window on the left is a timber aluminium composite that's been around in Australia for some time. Stegbar have been making timber aluminium composites, double glazed windows for a number of years, and they still are. They're still quite affordable and very good. We're starting to see more availability of systems that are creating more airtight windows. So the one on the left is a European window we use quite often, and that's a timber aluminium composite, but you can see the intricacy of the shape of the moldings. There's, I think, 4 separate seals when that window is closed. So you're achieving that air tightness, you're controlling that air movement through the windows, which windows are a weak chink in the armour of the house, whether it's the glazing, but it's often the frames. And I think Australian window manufacturers have been slow to catch up on providing frames that actually perform. So the one on the left's a European import. The one on the right is an Australian made using a European system. It's the UPVC. Okay, so the UPVC operates the same sort of principles in terms of the hardware and what you can do around the seals. The UPVC conducts much less energy than, say, a regular aluminium. We've been working with thermally improved aluminium and thermally broken aluminium as aluminium manufacturers in Australia try to lift their game, but they still conduct a significant amount of energy compared to something like the UPVC. The UPVC is probably 3/4 of the price of the imported higher end timber aluminium composite, but still very effective. And they look very much in the vernacular of an Australian modern building with the powder coated colours and things like that. The UPVC fits pretty well. So we're having a lot of success with those. The other thing with that is we've got local manufacturers. We don't have to necessarily import from Europe. We deal a lot in Wodonga for windows like these UPVC. Membranes is increasingly an area of development, and Simon alluded to the importance of membranes in controlling moisture, controlling mold, things like that. In recent times, the traditional sisal paper, the silver foil, often with a blue coating, often with a builder's trade name marked on it, has been the National Construction Code has largely sidelined that because in effect it doesn't breathe. It doesn't breathe at all. An analogy is wrapping your leg in a plastic bag. What's going to happen? You're going to sweat. And wrapping your house in a traditional sisal and sealing it up effectively, taping that in and things like that, and really doing a good job of that material just traps moisture in the house. So we deal a lot and have done for years in breather membranes. This image here is some higher end breather membranes. We do certified passive houses now, which is the higher end of performance, absolutely. And this is a membrane going on in the house in Bright currently. It breathes, it lets moisture, the fine moisture droplets out of the house. The battens over the face of that before we clad it means that moisture can dissipate. There's other, generally we use other less expensive breather membranes that are very, very effective as well. We don't necessarily have to go to enormous expense to achieve this stuff. But whatever you do with the membranes, after you've made that initial choice, you've got to make sure that we apply them correctly and we take care of them. This house also has slab edge insulation, and you can see young Nathan fitting that on as we speak. The red tape underneath is a termite membrane, a termite protection. So, but membranes, when you're driving around the estates, when you're watching how other people build, if you see they're putting the silver paper up on the building, I ask myself why, because it's effectively outlawed, except for a very narrow range of circumstances. So we need these breather membranes to allow the water out, to mitigate the condensation effects. As we seal up houses, we can make a mistake by sealing up a house and trapping moisture inside walls and ceilings and causing problems down the track. In a passive house, this is an example of an internal membrane where the moisture will pass through this membrane into the ceiling space, but this membrane is such that it creates an airtight barrier. So the popularity, or the growing popularity of the technology around passive house construction, where we have buildings that are offering a 95% reduction in energy over a conventional home, with thermal stability in there, with a lack of thermal break, with thermal break that stops energy leaking into the building unwantedly. So these kind of internal membranes, they've got a great role in actually bringing the house down to a point where you can control the airflow very well. You don't have to necessarily go to a full passive house certification, which is still a popular thing, but we can build really effective houses controlling the airflow. The pipes you see in the ceiling there are related to a heat recovery ventilator. So when we build something very airtight, we've got to make sure that we're getting fresh air in. And we can do that by a unit like this. This is a Zender Comfo Air. It brings fresh air into your house and it expels the stale air, but only expels the stale air after the energy that you have in the house is transferred into the fresh air. So you don't have any energy loss. It maintains your comfort levels, gives you fresh air. We're starting to see bushfire smokers installed on these things, which is a great development in places like Beechworth and Bright, where they are impacted by the necessity of control burning in the autumn, and unfortunately the bushfires when they roll through in the summer at times too. Again, more a bit of technology. All these things I'm talking about are proven technologies that have been brought to us from mostly European countries, where they've dealt with these issues of thermal comfort and healthy houses much longer than we ever have. So the technologies, there's some criticisms around some of these things at times I hear. Generally, when I dig down, they're pretty ill-informed. The systems are generally pretty proven. Another thing we're doing, I've seen a lot of, is a shift away from solar hot water and a shift to heat pump for creating hot water. Heat pumps had a bad rap for a long time because there are a lot of bad heat pumps. There's a lot of really good units around now. I'll put a couple of images up here to explain what a heat pump might look like. This is an air conditioner on the right, the Mitsubishi air conditioner. On the left is a Sandon heat pump. So they work on a similar principle of a heat exchange from the surrounding air. The Sandon heat pump and others like it. There's another unit called a Reclaim, or there's a Stiebel Eltron. They'll create hot water from air going down sub-zero temperatures. The Sandon will operate and make hot water at -6 degrees. The reason these are becoming much more popular than solar hot water services is that they provide that steady flow of hot water year round, whereas the solar is at its best in the summer months, obviously. They go hand in hand with the photovoltaic arrays on the roof. Dion's absolutely right with his encouragement of photovoltaics on the roof. You're creating your own energy. You're turning your house into all electric. Things like heat pumps make a lot of sense. And the bulk of our clients now are coming to us and saying, this is what we want. They're not necessarily after the solar hot water any longer. Besides the technology, I just want to touch on the execution of what we do. We can set up regulation, and we need to set up regulation. We've only, as I say, I've only observed significant change through regulation, although the passive house movement is one which is not done by regulation, but is done by enthusiasm of people who can see the value in it. So we've currently got a 6-star under a NatHERS. NatHERS is a government body that sets the standard for energy rating for Victoria specifically, and as well as parts of Australia. We currently got a 6-star. We're moving to a 7-star, and Simon's absolutely right. If you're not building 7-star now, you're really behind the 8 ball. I'm lucky enough to build in with houses where our average is sort of 7.5, 8 stars. We've got up, the highest we've done is 8.9. The star rating system is pretty imperfect, I have to say. It measures parts of the fabric of the house. There's lots of things about the performance of the house that aren't measured, that perhaps could be. The passive house standard is an example of a whole of house system that measures every aspect of the house's function. But look, before we had 5-star and 6-star, the major players, the project home people, weren't inclined to do anything. So moving that along to the 6 and 7 stars, and hopefully beyond that, is the way to bring them to heal into what is overall a community benefit. But the issue I have with it at times is that this is a 6-star on paper. The 6-star rating comes with part of your building permit, and that's fine. It will have a 7-star rating that you'll have to provide to get the building permit. That's terrific. But there are very, very, very little auditing or inspection of the measures that it takes to achieve the rating. We still struggle to get the building practices across the industry that mean that what you think you're paying for, you are actually getting. So here's a couple of photos which aren't mine. They're photos from the interweb. But you can see here with a house which may have had a specific insulation rating set for the walls and the ceiling, and from an infrared inspection, you can see that the installers, when they've come over to the edge of the roof, it's all been a bit hard to get over in the corners. So it just isn't there. Or we've got a house here with, again, the sisal wrap, which is the silver foil, which is effectively, not meant to be used now. It's still being used effectively. And when it is used, the trades come along, they'll pierce it, they'll cut slits in it. It's not necessarily taped on the joins. It's not, the windows and door openings aren't taped. There's not necessarily anything stopping air movement from underneath. So the policing of some of these measures that are assumed within the rating just doesn't happen. And that talks to the bigger frameworks we have around building inspections and building permits and the policing of that. That's a big subject on its own, because what we ask building surveyors to do is that they've got a massive job of monitoring a huge amount of regulation already, and they balk at having to become policemen of a different kind, if you like. So yeah. So that in a nutshell is just some of the little points I want to make tonight of things that I think make a difference around, again, orientation is key. adopting the technologies wherever you can, that's important, and making sure that you're dealing with people that are going to do it effectively, that are going to provide you with what you think you're buying. That's really important. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that, John.
Lockie, thank you very, very much for sharing all of that knowledge with us. Fascinating stuff and really interesting. It's been a great night for just seeing the problems that we're going to have to face up to, and also seeing some of the, I guess, some of the things we've got at our disposal to help us to deal with that future. Look, folks, we've run well and truly over time. We've got I'm noticing though that we've still got a lot of people with us. So I've got one question here that I'll just throw to anybody who wants to answer. And the question is, are there countries or jurisdictions that require an air leakage test on building? And
I can talk to that, John. The National Construction Code in the last iteration introduced a minimum air changes per hour for new construction, and that is in Australia. We're supposed to build houses that have it's measured by air changes per hour, that the air in a room will change no more than 10 times. That's the regulation in the construction code at the moment. So when we talk about passive house, which is again a really that I can't imagine the standard providing a higher sort of standard. They aspire to, or they demand an air change of 0.6 air changes per hour, 0.6. So, and you regularly see, for those of you that follow passive house, you'll see passive house builders producing houses 0.4 air changes per hour, 0.3 air changes per hour. So at 10 air changes per hour, that's a pretty high bar. It's not hard to achieve. With our own construction, where we pay a bit of attention to our membranes and our taping in, and without blowing our own horn too much around this, but just some basic things to get them right, you can get a house down to say 4 air changes per hour pretty easy. It's not that difficult. If you get below, say, 3 air changes per hour, that's where you're starting to get in an area where, well, we've got to think about how are we ventilating the house? What have we got to bring fresh air in, which brings us into the HRV world. So I can't speak for other jurisdictions around the world, although there are jurisdictions around the world that are mandating passive house construction now. They're insisting on that, particularly European countries. But in Australia, we're now expected to deliver 10 air changes per hour. The next step to that is to see that audited, to see that that's part of the outcome of the building permit, that the house is proven to deliver that. Because at the moment, while the figure is there's no sense of how that's going to be measured.
Rightio, Lockie, thank you very much for that. And look, at that, ladies and gentlemen, look, thank you so much to all of our presenters. Thank you, Bronwyn, Simon, Dion and Lockie. I've got to say thank you very much too to everybody who's hung on. I'm seeing that we've still got almost everybody here who started, and so obviously our speakers have been absolutely terrific in keeping us focused and entertained. And I'm getting messages in the chat, people saying fantastic, thanks everybody, and so I think that's just great. So gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I've got to just say too, finally, a thank you to the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, who've funded tonight and made that possible. As I said, we'll get the recording of this up onto YouTube and linked to the Wangaratta Landcare and Sustainability website as soon as we can, so people can go back over this and take the bits and pieces out and get the nuggets out of it. There's plenty of them there. So look, thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.